Hey, John.
Hello, Tyler.
I feel like I haven't seen you in like weeks. That can't be right though, because we do this all the time.
Yeah, no, it has been a few weeks actually, but a lot has happened.
Oh, good. Here, let me turn off that music. I'd hate for anyone to get distracted from all the awesome stuff we have to say today.
Yeah, we got a lot big show news plus awesome content. It's just a all-around good episode that we've got today.
Please tell me the big show news is that sign reel over your shoulder. Is that the news?
That is the news.
Other
Right
shoulder. There we
there.
go.
Yeah, we are official. We're an official podcast.
We are officially on air
And
according to the sign.
only our YouTube viewers will know why.
Oh, I
Or
just said.
except you just said something. So, yeah, we have an on-air sign, so everyone knows we are on air
Officially.
in the airwaves with them.
Well, that's
With
awesome. Well,
sweet truths.
I hope you've had a nice break. I hope you've been able to relax and have some fun.
Sure. How about you?
Life's great. Life is great, Dandy. So awesome. Well, since your life's going so well, why don't we just shift directly into something completely different? That is church history. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
Will that make you feel happier?
Sure, always. So, as I mentioned, we have a great episode today. And returning listeners will know that how our format works, right? We like to go through different primary sources chronologically. And these sources are items that have informed the LDS tradition over the last almost 200 years. And today, we're talking about the very first, or at least the context around the very first revelation that was written down and distributed to the masses. You might know it as Doctrine and Covenants, Section 3. Ever heard of it?
That I have heard of, yes. But if you were to ask me what's inside, I'd be much more familiar with 4 than 3.
Uh-huh. Well, that's because you're terrible in Sunday school, but
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So Doctrine and Covenants 3 is significant in the history of the church because it talks about how Joseph Smith messed up, essentially, by giving the 116 pages that he had translated with Martin Harris to Martin Harris, despite being told twice. This is a lesson that I'm sure every parent has taught to their children. I told you once, I told you twice, fine. Third time, fine. Have it your way. See how it turns out. And then Section 3 is the ultimate I told you so. So, again, the context around this is Joseph Smith and Martin Harris had translated 116 pages of the gold plates. Martin Harris's wife had been pestering him, for lack of a better word, to show him the plates, and if not the plates, then the manuscript. And Martin Harris kept pleading with Joseph to have access to the pages, to take home to Palmyra to show his wife, to placate her somewhat.
Could I ask a question off the cuff?
Sure.
You said this is the first revelation ever written down that we know of. Why is it number 3, DNC 3, instead of DNC 1? Do we know? Is there?
Yeah. So Doctrine and Covenants is not organized chronologically. I'm not. That's a good question. I'm not sure why it's number 3 as opposed to number 1, other than number 1 kind of lays the foundation for the church and how it operates, the authority of the church. It's sort of like a preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. So that's a good question that we could look into in a later episode, which we will definitely once we get to.
I'm sorry. So probably just to make the book itself flow a little better then.
Yeah, I would think so.
Or maybe put the message that they thought was the most important up front, or something like that. It wasn't due to just shuffling the papers up, and that's where it happened to end up, probably.
Right. Yeah. They didn't just. I don't think they just threw them on the floor and just gathered them up and said, "This is the order." But maybe.
I thought you were going to say I don't think they just threw them out the window of a printing press and just picked them up and off the ground to just and then whatever order they ended up in, that was the new chapter
in some section. Missouri town.
That would just be too off the too like ridiculous to even contemplate.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Who would do that? So no, I don't have an answer to that question, but we'll definitely get into that in a different episode when we talk about the formulation of Doctrine and Covenants.
Cool.
But yeah, so what happened was Martin Harris got a hold of the 116 pages, and Joseph gave them to him after he had asked for permission from the Lord 3 times. The 3rd time, the Lord said yes. Martin Harris takes them back to Palmyra, and we'll go from there. They get lost, and then we get section 3. There's the preface.
Awesome.
Okay. So I'd like to start by talking about what were exactly the 116 pages. So in the last few episodes, we talked about the translation process. Joseph, in 1828, is living in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He just bought a farm from his father-in-law, just a small farm. And the idea was that he would do translation, the translation there, because it was more quiet and peaceful than in Palmyra, where his family was kind of suffering through some persecutions. So he's in Harmony, and Martin Harris comes out to join him to help with the translation. Repeat listeners will know that Martin was very invested in this project, and he wanted to help as much as he could. So they start transcribing the pages, and they work from April 1828 to June 1828. And they translate what is called the Book of Lehi, which covers Lehi's ministry to about 130 BC.
And Lehi's ministry is 600 BC?
Roughly, yeah, that's right. So in the preface to the Book of Mormon, the original Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith talks about this Book of Lehi. And he mentions that the Book of Lehi was an abridgment of the plates of Lehi done by Mormon. So it's just like the rest of the Book of Mormon, right? Where Mormon, the ancient American prophet, took all these Nephite records, abridged them, and turned them into a single record. So that's what the Book of Lehi is. And apparently the plates of Lehi, or the Book of Lehi, are just another name for this first section of the large plates of Nephi. And we'll get into what that is in a little bit. So go ahead.
I was mostly listening. Is that a good way of putting it? You said Mormon did his abridgment. Mormon's abridgment was of, as I understood, it started later on in the book. Like the first few chapters, Mormon didn't touch, correct?
Sort of. In the copy that we have, that's true. Okay. And we'll get into this a little bit later.
Okay, maybe you'll clarify then.
Yeah.
I'll hold off on that.
But so they start with Joseph and Martin are translating the Book of Lehi which starts with Lehi's family in Jerusalem and goes all the way to King Benjamin. So it covers several hundred years of Nephite history.
King Benjamin's in the book of Mosiah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess we could clarify what all the books are. Let's see. We got 1st and 2nd Nephi, Jacob, Enos, Jerem, and Omni.
Those are the books prior to Mosiah?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's one more, but we'll get to that. Words of Mormon is there too. But okay. So the interesting thing, though, is we know that this existed, or at least there's other parts of the Book of Mormon as it is now that mention the Book of Lehi. One example is 1st Nephi chapter 1, verse 17. So the very first chapter of the Book of Mormon as we have it now has Nephi saying, I shall make an account of my proceedings in my days. Behold, I make an abridgment of the record of my father upon plates which I have made with mine own hands. Wherefore, after I have abridged the record of my father, then I will make an account of mine own life. So we know that theoretically there was another record out there, or another account of Lehi's family. So the Book of Mormon also talks about there's 2 plates of Nephi, right? There's the large plates of Nephi and the small plates. The small plates passed on more spiritual information that deal with the religious life of the Nephites. And so the small plates of Nephi cover roughly the same time that is described, that the 116 pages are described to have covered.
So see if I understand this then. For the records that we know of that covered Lehi's family, we have the record of Lehi that he wrote. We have the large plates of Nephi that are more just kind of, I don't want to say storytelling, but kind of telling the history focused. And then we have the small plates of Nephi, which is telling the same story, but from a more spiritual focus. Did I get that?
That's what we're kind of focusing on right now.
And we're focusing on the small plates, which is a spiritual, which is what's included in the current Book of Mormon.
Right. Okay. So currently, that's the small plates of Nephi make up 1st, 2nd Nephi, all the way to the Words of Mormon.
Okay.
So, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So, so Joseph and Martin translate these 116 pages, which again are Mormon's abridgment of the Book of Lehi, which are part of the large plates of Nephi. So it's pretty confusing, but hopefully everyone's following. I guess if you just wanted to simplify it, the Book of Lehi was an abridgment made by Mormon that covers the secular history of Lehi to King Benjamin. The small plates of Nephi are written by Nephi that cover the same period, but more spiritual, religious aspects of things.
Okay.
So Martin loses the 116 pages. We'll talk a little bit more about, the how that happened. And then Joseph is told in a revelation not to go back and retranslate that portion. So he and Oliver, the following year, pick up the translation with King Benjamin in the Book of Mosiah. And then they translate the rest of Mormon's abridgment. So this is where it gets a little confusing, because in the current Book of Mormon that we have, it starts off with 1st Nephi and then goes through the rest, right? But in the gold plates that Joseph was translating, that section, 1st Nephi, that we have was actually at the end. So Joseph didn't translate that until he got through I don't know what it would be, like 4th Nephi, or no, it would have been the Book of Mormon, right? So he translates
the last book.
Yeah. yeah, like the third to last book in the present Book of Mormon, is the Book of Mormon, and then it gets into a section called the Words of Mormon, which he translated, and then he translated the small plates of Nephi. But instead of leaving it in that order, he took those plates, or that portion of the translation, and moved it back to the beginning of the book to keep it chronologically straight.
So
is that clear as mud, or have I confused
yes,
you?
yes, and I wish I knew exactly where this is going because I have a lot of questions, but maybe I'll maybe just to make sure I understand this portion of it. Then, if I were to open up the gold plates and I could read them, then I would. There's a sealed portion, right?
We're not going to talk about that at all, though.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Do we know if that's the beginning or the end or middle?
I have no idea.
Okay, so there's a sealed portion. And then, but the part that's unsealed, then it would have been Mormon's abridgment of the Book of Lehi, which covers from 600 AD until King Mosiah 130 B. 600 BC to King
Benjamin.
King Benjamin, which is 100 and something AD. And then it continues on with Mosiah and all that through the time of Mormon, who built that abridgment. And then he also added to the back of that the book of Nephi, which goes from First Nephi, Second Nephi up to Omni. And then that would be, as far as we know, that'd be the end of the book, the gold plates.
And then there would have been the Book of Ether and the Book of Moroni. Yeah.
Ether and Moroni. Okay.
Right.
And so I guess what the question I'm getting at then is that at the end of the book, at the end of the plates, where we had the words of Nephi, that coincidentally matched exactly the time period of the Book of Lehi that was lost directly, right? Is that true?
Correct? Yeah. So it covered the same time period, but had different material in it.
A different focus, content. a different author, well, a different person writing it down. And then, okay, that clarifies things. And so when Joseph Smith translated it, he also translated it the order that the gold plates would have been, which would be Mormon's abridgment, and then Nephi, or you said the Words of Mormon. So the Words of Mormon actually exist between the Nephi's books and Mormon's abridgment there. So even though that was the back of the gold plates, Joseph Smith moved it between. Well, he moved all of Nephi's stuff up to the front, and then the Words of Mormon right there to kind of help explain what's going on in the book.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. I think I follow.
Yeah. So Words of Mormon kind of clarifies it a little bit. In that book, which is just, the one chapter, Mormon says, after I had made an abridgment from the plates of Nephi down to the reign of this King Benjamin. Okay, I have to pause here. When he's talking about the plates of Nephi here, he's talking about the large plates of Nephi, which was the entire history of the Nephites, right? So after I had finished that abridgment, I searched among the records which had been delivered into my hands, and I found these plates, which contained this small account of the prophets from Jacob down to the reign of this King Benjamin, and also many of the words of Nephi. So does that make sense?
That helps, yeah. So they were put at the end of the gold plates because after Mormon, so Mormon abridged everything, and then he found this small plate, and and was either inspired or coincidentally said, I want to put this in the back of the book as well. Does he say why? For a wise purpose.
Yeah, he does say. So he goes on and says, wherefore I chose these things to finish my record upon them, which remainder of my record I shall take from the plates of Nephi. So now he's talking about the small plates.
Okay.
It's a mess. I don't know why they refer to both of them that way, but
As the
then he
plates of
says,
Nephi.
yeah, it's not confusing at all. Then he says, I shall take these plates, which contain these prophesyings and revelations, and put them with the remainder of my record, for they are choice unto me, and I know they will be choice unto my brethren. And I do this for a wise purpose, for thus it whispereth me, according to the workings of the Spirit. So in Mormon tradition, LDS tradition, this is the story here is that is one of prophecy, right? Mormon received some kind of divine communication that said he needed to put in the plates of Nephi, the small plates of Nephi, into his abridgment, but he didn't exactly know why. He knew they were valuable, but he didn't know what the purpose would be because, as he says earlier, he had already made an abridgment of the large plates of Nephi. So again, in LDS tradition, this is a big moment, and it sort of reinforces the later narrative of losing the 116 pages and not having to go back and retranslate them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, gotcha.
So Joseph translates this. Then he continues translating First Nephi through Omni, and the small plates of Nephi were translated last by Joseph Smith. But then again, as I mentioned, they were inserted by him into their proper chronological place. So then the question becomes, how do we know that that's what happened? How do we know Joseph didn't just that he translated them in this order? Well, it's, not only did he say that he did, but also in the paper that the translation is written on, so the handwriting that Oliver Cowdery and Emma Smith and a few others actually wrote on, John Whitmer's handwriting appears in the First Nephi to Words of Mormon section. Now, as I said, they were translating in Harmony, Pennsylvania for most of the time. But at some point, they moved to Fayette, New York, which is where the Whitmers were, again, to get a little bit more peace and be able to focus. Plus, they had the Whitmer family to kind of take care of them. So it was just a better situation for them. They moved to Fayette to do that around June. And so if you look at the order of the translation, then it would make sense that John Whitmer's handwriting would show up later in those handwritten pages. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So John Whitmer's handwriting appears in the First Nephi to Words of Mormon section because that was done later. That section was translated later.
I was going to believe you just by saying it, but that explanation also helps. So thank you. I would have just taken your word for that one.
You could ask. Yeah. I try to prepare for all your questions, Tyler, and then every once in a while you throw one at me like, how come this isn't in the beginning of Doctrine and Covenants? I don't know.
Well, I just appreciate you going back and doing this lost pages anyway, because when you brought up the idea, I thought, oh yeah, why we didn't even. There's a lot to dig into, and we didn't do it. So I think this is great.
Yeah, I thought we maybe could skip it just because we talked about the translation process so much, but no, it makes sense to go over it because it is a pretty important part in LDS tradition. So.
Right.
Okay, one more thing too, a little bit of a tidbit about what was in the Book of Lehi. There was a letter from Lucy Mack Smith to her sister that the Book of Lehi told the story of Lehi leaving Jerusalem with his family and his wife Sariah's brother's family just a few days before Nebuchadnezzar burned the city. Have you ever heard about that, Tyler? That Lehi's brother-in-law joined them also?
No comment, John. You can't put the notes in front of me. You can't put the notes in front of me and then ask a question like that.
I didn't think you read the notes, but yeah.
I don't. Kidding. I don't, but you put an exclamation mark saying just kidding. And so I just had to fight to keep a straight face as you read that. But no, previous to this, I've never heard that before. But I am a little bit familiar with where you're going with the just kidding. So
yeah. So I had heard this. I had forgotten that I had heard this until I was preparing this episode. It's like, oh yeah, somebody did once tell me that Soraya's brother joined them. But it turns out that that letter from Lucy Mack Smith, it was found in the 80s, and Mormon historians or Mormon history nerds and buffs that listen will know what happened in the 80s, right? It turns out it was a Mark Hoffman forgery. So that's kind of a fun little piece of trivia for you. Any questions on that? Any follow-up comments? Anything like that?
I sure hope we have an episode or 2 or 3 or 7 on Mark Hoffman.
Yeah, I'd love to do an episode on that. I mean, a lot's been said about him, but we can always add our 2 cents. All right. So anyway, so that's kind of the format of the gold plates, or the translation as it was originally done, and also the chronology of how it was translated. So they get through those 116 pages. Harris begs Joseph to let him take those pages. Joseph finally relents and says, okay, take them. But he makes a promise. He makes Martin Harris promise him that he will only show them to 5 specific people. The first one is his wife, whose name was Lucy. The second was his brother, then his parents, his mom and his dad, and then his wife's sister. And those were the only people he was allowed to show the pages to. He, according to the story, he broke that covenant, or that promise, and he showed them to a few people. There's pretty good evidence that he showed them to one of his very good close friends. And the interesting thing about this whole story is that the way it's told now is kind of done in this linear fashion where Martin lost the plates, or he lost the pages. We don't know where they went. We don't know how they were lost. Joseph, lost his gift of translation, whatever. He had to take a break, and then he repented and was able to get it back. And that's kind of all we get. But there's so many different versions of this story if you go back into the source material. And that speaks to how sort of massive it was in the early days of the church, how important this story was. So the story, if you were to just go do some light reading on this, it would say that Martin showed them to too many people, and then they were stolen. There's one version that says he showed, and this version comes from Lucy Mack Smith. He showed the pages to his wife. His wife was pleased, and she let Martin store the pages in her desk bureau thing that had a lock on it. And Martin got carried away and wanted to show the pages to his good friend. And he didn't have a key to Lucy's, his wife's, bureau, so he picked the lock and damaged it. But he got the pages out and showed them to his friend. And then after that, they weren't secure anymore. So somebody could have just come in and taken them. But then there's another version that says, no, Martin had a key to the bureau. He locked the bureau, and then he locked the room that the bureau was in, and he had both sets of keys when he went to bed that night. So something else must have happened. And there's a whole list of other things. And it all comes from people who, secondhand sources or rumors, people who talked to so-and-so who was Martin Harris's second cousin once removed. There's lots of different versions of the story, which I think is super interesting because, again, it shows how sort of important or popular or immense the story was back in the early days of the church. Okay, so we know that Martin probably showed them around, and then the pages disappeared. So then the story goes that Joseph didn't hear from Martin for a long time. He goes back to Palmyra. like right after his firstborn son was delivered and died. And Emma was very, very sick. So it's a very hard time in his life. He goes back to Palmyra, confronts Martin, and Martin breaks down and tells him that he's lost the pages. And the way that Lucy Mack describes it, it's a very emotional and very intense moment where Joseph basically, he literally believes that his soul is lost and that he's going to hell. So that's the story.
But by he, Joseph thinks that Joseph's soul was lost or that Martin's soul was lost?
Joseph thinks that his own soul was lost.
Joseph thinks that he's... Okay.
Yeah, and Martin probably did too.
And as I understand, it took him a long time after this to get back to translating. It wasn't a quick decision. All right, well, let's keep going and figure it out. But rather, it was a substantial amount of time before they continued.
Yeah, it was about. So this happened in June, July of 1828, and the translation didn't pick up full steam again until April of 1829, when Oliver met up with Joseph.
Okay.
So then the question is, like, so what happened? Does anyone actually know what happened to the 116 pages or how they were stolen? In traditional LDS history, we have Doctrine and Covenants, section 10, in which Joseph receives a revelation that says that wicked men stole the pages. And it says, because they have altered the words, they read contrary from that which you translated and caused to be written. And on this wise, they may say they have caught you in the words which you have pretended to translate. So that's the overarching theory in LDS tradition, right? Is that they were stolen by some people who were trying to give Joseph a bad name and discredit him.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned how poorly I did in Sunday school class, and I'd always heard this and thought of it as he thought that somebody might translate, somebody might alter it, or someone might do it, and he didn't want to do it. I didn't realize, even though I'm sure I've read it before, that it calls out that somebody has altered the words. That does bring up a question, and you may not be the forgery expert. Is it reasonable? I don't want to say reasonable. At that time, I imagine it would be reasonable to believe that someone could alter it with enough precision that it would go unnoticed by some people who would have to know that it's been altered. Is that how say the people? Not obviously Joseph would think that, but what about just the observer at that time looking at it? Would it make sense, like, oh yeah, someone could alter it and we wouldn't be able to notice that there's been changes to ink and paper?
Yeah. You mean, so you're talking about like the handwritten copies?
Is that what he took, or was it printed?
Yeah, so the handwritten copies were taken.
Yeah,
that's true. I think the idea, though, was that they were going to wait until the book was published, because Joseph, he's not gonna show anybody the handwritten copies, right? So
right.
he would publish them, and then somebody could say, "Oh, look, this is another copy, and he's made changes to it," which means that he's lying. It's not a revelation, right? But you bring up a good.
Oh, I'm sorry. But that person who altered it, I guess my question is, I don't know what technology they had back then, but I imagine it'd be very difficult I mean, not to alter it, but to alter it such that someone wouldn't notice by looking at it. Say, hey, this has been altered.
Yeah. Are you talking about the handwritten pages?
Yeah. Or... the altered pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know.
I think I see what you mean. Like, if, let's say, they publish it and then somebody comes out and says, look, I have the handwritten pages and they're different. and then Joseph could come and say, "No, I have the handwritten pages, and they're the same." Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Not quite, because I'm presuming that if Joseph is translating it again, that it would be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so
The
if
same.
it's the same, and the wicked men that have taken them altered them, my question is what they altered of the words.
Oh,
Was
couldn't they
there
tell that they
is
were like
like
scribbled and?
is it reason like, well, look, it's different than what the pages are, and all the differences are crossed out with different handwriting on top. I don't know, but I don't want to go. I mean, is
Yeah,
that
I
what?
see.
How
I think I see what you mean. Well,
it,
yeah. I mean, maybe they could have written it on different paper,
Mark Hoffman
and
could do it,
yeah, they could have written it on different paper and tried to copy the handwriting.
something like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I think the idea though was to wait for the published edition to come out and then publish their own thing, or when I say publish, I mean print it on a, and then say, look, there's differences. But
Okay, so it may not be that they're trying to prove that the actual original manuscript's different, but the manuscript that they have imprinted is different than the manuscript that would have otherwise been created.
yeah, that
Okay.
that could be one strategy. And the interesting thing though is that there are different ideas of what the strategy was. So, for example, there's one guy named John Clark. He was a pastor in Palmyra who knew the Harrises, and he said that Lucy Harris told him that she had taken the pages and given them to someone else for safekeeping so that she could have them published at some point in the future to discredit Joseph. And he said, this is a direct quote, "Suspicion immediately fastened upon Mrs. Harris." This is after the pages were taken. "She, however, refused to give any information in relation to the matter, but she simply replied, 'If this be a divine communication, the same being who revealed it to you can easily replace it.'" So then he goes on and says that she did not make any changes. She didn't alter the manuscript at all, but she believed that a retranslation would not be verbatim. So she kind of assumed, according to this theory, that Joseph was dig his own grave by not copying it exactly as he had dictated it the first time. Does that make sense?
Or the counter to that, he could prove to whoever stole these papers, hey, this is a real translation because I just recreated it again, and it matches. But
yeah,
but this, I mean, John Clark, Palmyra preacher, I have no reason to think that he was involved in taking it or really had any real skin in the game per se.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what his sort of where his stance was, but that's a good question.
But well, I guess he did. I mean, obviously he did say, or no, she said. So I'm just going to paraphrase what you said too. So John Clark, a Palmyra preacher, so a preacher in the area, said that she refused to give any information in relation to the matter, but she simply. Oh, I'm sorry. This is why I'm doing it because I didn't catch it the first time. So John Clark, he just said that Lucy had him for safekeeping, and that she Lucy Harris could have published them to discredit Joseph, and then Lucy replied to that by saying, if it's a divine communication, the same being who revealed it can easily replace it. So that kind of goes where I was saying in the first place, that Lucy, according to this narrative, Lucy was saying that, hey, if I hold on to these and God gave this information to Joseph, he can just as easily do it again. So that's kind of where I said that Joseph could really prove himself by recreating it again.
Right.
That okay. Now I get where you're going with that. Thank you for. Oh, maybe not.
Well, when she says that, like the tone of it is kind of tongue in cheek, you know. Well, let's see him recreate it word for word. If he's so holy,
I love taking
then
that literally.
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I believe you. I believe you. But man, taking it
yeah,
literally is a whole new meaning.
yeah. So I would, the reason it's sarcastic, I would argue that it's sarcastic, is because Clark believed that she took it and that she did it maliciously. That bears out in the record. He's not giving her the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
And he goes on to say that Martin Harris knew that she took the pages. In fact, he beat her to try to get her to give them back. He said he beat her with a rod, but she never turned the pages back over to him. And then there's another witness who said that Lucy Harris actually turned the pages over to a guy named Dr. Seymour, who would read them to his patients. And he said that it was a description of the mounds about the country and similar to the Book of Mormon. This is in reference to the mounds that we talked about a few episodes ago.
Yeah.
You know,
What did we call those? Not did we call those? What? Just mounds? Is that what they're referred to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, like those burial mounds. Some of them were burial mounds. Some of them were for building higher structures.
For some reason, I thought there was a more exact name for them, but I don't recall.
No, I don't think so. It's been a while.
I don't. Then we don't listen to this stuff. We just
we don't
throw it out there and forget about it.
Hopefully, we don't. It'll never come back to haunt us. I'm sure of that. So there's another one, a guy named Charles Comstock Richards, who was the son of Franklin D. Richards, who was an apostle in the LDS Church later on. And he said that his father, Franklin Richards, met a man named in 1880. So this is 50 years after, right? He meets this guy named Dr. J.R. Pratt, who claimed, is probably a better way to say it, that he could put his hand on the manuscript, which Martin Harris lost, in an hour if it was needed. So then we have this, albeit questionable source, saying that the manuscript was still out there somewhere, and that this guy actually knew exactly where it was. He could get it whenever he wanted. So the point of these sources, though, is to show that there were both Mormons and non-Mormons, or pro-Joseph Smith, anti-Joseph Smith, who believed that the pages were stolen to discredit Joseph. Now, then the other tradition, that the other, I guess, major tradition, there's two big stories. We just covered the one. The second is that Lucy just simply burned the pages. In 1884, there was a guy named Larry Saunders, who said that Lucy told him that she had burned them and that she never actually denied that she had burned them. So there's that. But then we go to E.D. Howe, who we've talked about before. He's the guy who put together Mormonism Unveiled, which was the sort of the first major anti-Mormon literature. They actually interviewed Lucy for that pamphlet, and she did deny burning them. And that interview took place in 1833.
So I'm looking at the dates of those, and one person said she burned them in 1884. Another said she did not burn them in 1833. Is there any room that she burned them between 1833 and 1884?
Yeah. So I got to clarify that. So the guy Larry Saunders said that in 1884. He didn't say she burned them in 1884.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I guess it still leaves room for her to burn them anytime after 1833.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there are some thoughts out there that they're both true, that she stole them with the intent of discrediting Joseph. And then at some point later, maybe she changed her mind or she knew it wasn't going to work. Then she decided to burn them.
I hope this isn't a spoiler. They've never been discovered. Right. So, I mean, to know what happened to them at this juncture, it's going to be quite difficult, seeing as there's no evidence other than what these people are saying.
Right. So, yeah, interestingly enough, apparently, and eventually when we get to this episode, apparently Mark Hoffman was telling people that he was close to finding them. And during the FBI investigations after the bombings happened, they interviewed some of the Harris family, like the descendants of Martin Harris. And one of the descendants told the FBI that the family story was that Lucy burned the pages.
I have to ask. Well, obviously, I mean, you mentioned Hoffman said that he's close to finding them. Do I care? Like, why does that come up? Because obviously, if he was going to find them, then he wasn't actually going to find them.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, now it doesn't matter.
At the time, nobody knew that, including church leaders and everyone else. So it meant something at the time. It would have been important at the time. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I'll give you that.
So yeah, just a little bit on Hoffman. The way he worked early on was he created these documents and then he would sell them. But towards the end, he worked in reverse order. He would try to get investors first. Say, you tell them, look, I'm close to finding such and such manuscript, but I need some more money or whatever. Or he'd arrange for them to buy them before he turned them over, right? So if he were to go to a potential investor and say, hey, look, I'm close to finding the 116 pages. I've got a strong lead. How about throwing some of that cheddar cheese my way? You know, that's
I believe it's just cheddar.
People are. I've heard it both ways.
You're lucky I trust you with that on air sign. If you didn't have that, I'd call you out on that one. But I got to give you the benefit of the doubt because of the sign.
It's official.
Creates authority.
Yeah. So okay, and then one, I think, is this the final interesting story about this? Maybe. Anyway, another interesting story about this is there's this guy. I won't mention names, but this he's kind of a big name in Mormon circles, I guess. But he told this story, and he has it written down. That
why aren't you mentioning his name?
Because I don't have his permission to tell the story.
Oh, he's still alive.
Yeah.
And you don't have permission for that. Okay, that's fair. I thought you were talking to someone who died back with.
No. This is my own experience.
Your own experience.
And I actually just found it written down somewhere, but he didn't. Okay. He didn't name names when he wrote it down. But anyway, this guy I know, his dad buys a first edition copy of the Book of Mormon. He'd always wanted one. He buys it, and it's delivered to him. And inside the book, he finds out that it was once owned by B.H. Roberts, who was a leader in the LDS Church at the turn of the 20th century. And in this book, there's a note in the margin above the preface, which is where Joseph talked about the lost 116 pages. The note says that this is what it says, word for word. Martin says that the preface is all incorrect and should not be regarded or read. And next to that note, there's another note that says, I do not know who wrote the above. And then it's signed by B.H. Roberts. So.
Conspiracy theory time?
I don't know, man. Apparently, there's somebody who claimed to have talked to Martin at some point, and supposedly Martin Harris told them that this was all wrong and should just be disregarded. So anyway, kind of an interesting story.
I'm giving you an assignment, John. Get permission from this acquaintance, whoever it is, to take a photograph of that and put it on our Instagram page.
So that's where it gets. This is where my story maybe falls apart in your eyes, Tyler, because the book was sold to this guy by mistake. It was actually a collector's item, and the book dealer sold him the wrong copy.
Oh, he didn't. The wrong copy, meaning not the original, or.
So he was supposed to sell him a first edition Book of Mormon,
right?
But he sold him the wrong first edition of the Book of Mormon. the one that he sold him was actually belonged to someone else, and he sold it by mistake. So he actually called the guy, this guy that I know. He called this guy's father and said, "Hey, can I get the book back? I sold you the wrong one." And so that he ended up having to give the book back and got a different copy.
So you're telling me this is told after the fact, third hand, with no evidence, and you expect who of our audience? Haven't we been teaching this whole time that the level of confidence we should have in stories?
I said it was an interesting story. That's all. I didn't claim it was true. Or
you are one lucky man that you have the on-air sign behind you, and I have to believe every word out of your mouth tonight.
So yeah, you're right. I should have prefaced it. This is a story I heard from a guy I know about what he saw in his first edition Book of Mormon. Does that work? Okay.
That's much better. I think that is important information to know, because that's the type of story that either gets taken out of context or travels too faster than it should, and then people learn what happens that isn't part of the story. So for the integrity of the podcast, I'll go back and edit this little this last part and just leave it the way it was originally, just so it can travel and people will tune in.
We definitely want to. This is juicy stuff.
Hot take.
So I will say this: this story is written down in a book on Mormon history, in the footnotes of a book, so it's out there. So I'm not, making this up. It's actually out there. It's printed in a book that's been published by a legitimate publisher. So maybe some of our listeners who are real sleuths can find it.
Could I ask for one clue? Does this book have an agenda to is it meant to be an objective history, or does it have an agenda one way or another?
That's a great question. It's published by an objective publisher, so it's a reputable publisher. It's an academic publisher. Is who put it out. The author, that's a harder question because everybody has some kind of objective. So,
but it's not published by publishers who just publish church material, pro or anti. It's published by an objective academic publisher. Okay. Well, that's it. That's a clue.
Yeah, there's a clue for you. And I don't know, maybe I could tell it. Maybe he wouldn't really care, but whatever. So, that's that interesting story. Okay, so a little bit more about the 116 pages. There are some indications that the 116 pages had some of King Benjamin's sermon. So in the Book of Mormon, there's a character named King Benjamin who gives a very long and intense sermon. It's sort of his farewell sermon because he's about to die. And it's written in part of the book called the Book of Mosiah. And there's some indication that part of that sermon was in the 116 pages. And that comes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 10. Let's see. It says, therefore you shall translate the engravings. No, that's not it. Sorry. Shoot. We might have to edit this out.
I don't edit anything.
I can't find the exact. Anyway, in section 10, there's some indication that says you'll translate the portion until you come to the reign of King Benjamin, or until you come to that which you have translated, which you have retained. So that indicates that he gave the 116 pages. So it's the opposite of what I said, actually. So the 116 pages may or may not have had part of King Benjamin, but it sounds like they didn't, and that there were some pages left over that Joseph kept that he didn't give to Martin.
And do you know then if this would have been written and my you're the time guy here. So, but I just asked the questions. So, would this section 10 of Doctrine and Covenants been written before Joseph Smith would have translated the, we'll call them First Nephi to Omni section, or after?
It would have been before.
Okay.
So yeah, there is in section 10. If you look at the heading in the Doctrine and Covenants, it gives the date of 1829. Let me see if I can pull up exactly what it says. Give me 1 second. Okay, yeah. So this section 10 probably came around April of 1829. So just as Joseph was starting to get back into the translation. But apparently there was some mistake that was made in an earlier copy of Doctrine and Covenants, because it said that this revelation came in the summer of 1828, which would have been right after the pages were lost. So it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't fit the rest of the narrative. So it's safe to assume that the April 1829 is the correct time, and it would have been right before Joseph picks up translating the Book of Mosiah.
Okay, can I make sure I understand that? So the Doctrine and Covenants say that this revelation was received in 1828?
1829.
Okay, Doctrine and Covenants now say that it was received in 1829. When did it say, what source has 1828 as the date it was?
So in a previous edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, which I think was just like a few years ago, I think they fixed it just a few years ago.
Okay, so in previous Doctrine and Covenants, section 10 read that Joseph Smith received a revelation that he should translate the engravings of Nephi down to the reign of King Benjamin, or until that which he's already translated. And what you're saying is that the date that it was put in there would have been right after he lost the plates in 1828, but it's now been corrected to be 1829, which would have been after he's already begun translating again and would have translated the reign of King Benjamin.
So yeah, it was right before he started translating again.
Oh, right before he started translating. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's kind of confusing. Older editions of Doctrine and Covenants say he received that translation, which is section 10, in the summer of 1828, which doesn't make sense because that's right after the pages were lost. But the current edition says that it was likely received in April 1829. So anyway,
why doesn't it make sense that it would happen right after he lost them?
So yeah, section 10 talks about how he's lost his gift, right? But he's been forgiven and that he can start translating again.
Okay, so that section is saying that he can. Okay.
Yeah, but we know he didn't start translating again. He didn't even try to start translating again until April of 1829.
Yeah, so that revelation gave him permission to start translating again, but he didn't start for another 8 or so months.
Right.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah. So, and then just to kind of round things up, April 1829, Joseph and Oliver Cowdery start translating again, and they have it published a year later.
And the rest is history.
Yes, as they say. Yeah.
As if none of the rest is any less history.
It's all some history.
Yeah. Cool.
I wonder if we have any listeners left.
Kudos to you. I used to listen to a podcast, and I won't say, well, I could say what it is, but it's changed names multiple times because it's a Washington NFL team's podcast, and they have to keep changing the name every time the football team keeps changing their name. But at the end of the podcast, his call off sign was, if you made it this far, I owe you a beer. So, and now that he's gaining popularity, he actually throws parties where he gets everyone a drink.
That would be pretty good. I wonder how many of our LDS listeners would take us up on that.
If you made it this far, I will buy you a bottle of IBC root beer. Just let us know and come find me, and I will gladly run to the store then and there and pick it up for you and hand it to you. I'll even maybe sign it if I'm feeling generous.
Ooh, a signed can of IBC root beer from Tyler Jones. I'll be posting your address on Instagram.
You make it too easy. Well, you're at it. Post the address of that mysterious source who had the first edition Book of Mormon.
Yeah. All right.
No. All right, cool. Well, this is great. Do we know what we're doing next week? Do we just want to keep it a surprise?
Yeah. So the next episode, I'm thinking we dive into the 1830s. We've talked about the 1820s a lot. 1830s is a great decade because that's when the church really starts gaining ground and gathering steam. And we'll start with the church organization because, there's a standard narrative of that too, but not a lot of context around it. So that should be fun to talk about.
Cool. That'll be great. Well, thanks, John.
Thank you.
I'm trying to remember because it's been so long. I know I had a cool call off. Life's rough. Roll on. Man, I like that other one. I'll just buy you a drink better. Sorry.
Be sure to tell your friends, and you can subscribe wherever fine podcasts are sold. That's just what I would add to
that. I concur.